Jonathan Hale, a widowed and grumpy former president, hires Ruby Anderson, his new Texan caregiver, to be his date at the Presidential Day celebration. And everyone is shocked when she starts to say that. What happens when a grumpy and reclusive former president takes his irreverent Texan caregiver as his date to a political event? And the moment she opens her mouth, she leaves everyone in shock? Before we continue, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching the video from. And don't forget to subscribe. In the dimly lit living room of his sprawling estate, Jonathan Hale sat slumped on a well-worn armchair, a relic from better days when laughter filled the air and the walls resonated with joy. Now, it stood as a silent witness to his solitude. The soft glow of the table lamp flickered like a dying ember, casting elongated shadows that danced across the walls, where photographs of a life once vibrant now seemed to mock him with their cheerful smiles. In those frames, he could see the essence of his late wife, Eleanor, radiating warmth and love in every captured moment. Her laughter echoed in his mind, an ever-present reminder of what he had lost. The television blared in the background, its sounds drowning in the thick atmosphere of melancholy that enveloped him. He had left it on as a distraction, but the news anchor's voices were little more than a distant hum, failing to penetrate the cocoon of his thoughts. He felt like a ghost, haunting the spaces they once shared together, a shadow of the man who had once commanded attention and respect as the President of the United States. Now, he was merely a recluse, withdrawn from the world outside his four walls, shackled by grief. As he gazed out the window, the streetlights flickered to life, illuminating the quiet neighborhood. The vibrant colors of the sunset were fading into a muted gray, mirroring the dullness that had seeped into his life since Eleanor's passing. Friends and political allies had urged him to re-enter society, to shed the layers of cynicism that had formed around his heart. Yet, every time he contemplated stepping out, an overwhelming wave of anxiety washed over him, tethering him to his grief. The doorbell rang, a sharp sound that broke through his reverie. He glanced at the clock, surprised to see that it was well past the hour he had expected visitors. Reluctantly, he shuffled to the door, his old bones creaking in protest. He opened it to reveal Tom, a longtime friend and confidant whose presence had always been a source of comfort amidst the turbulence of his life. Tom's face wore a mixture of concern and determination, as if he were prepared to wage war on Jonathan's self-imposed isolation. Tom stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the disarray that had become a testament to Jonathan's neglect. "You really should think about getting out more, Jonathan," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "The Presidential Day celebration is just around the corner, and it would do you good to attend." Jonathan felt a surge of irritation rise within him. The idea of mingling with old political allies, of facing the probing questions about his personal life, made his skin crawl. He had no desire to relive the past, to navigate the treacherous waters of public scrutiny. "I don't see the point," he replied, his voice heavy with resignation. "What do they want from me? Sympathy? Pity?" Tom shook his head, his expression unwavering. "It's not just about you, Jonathan. It's about honoring your legacy, about showing the world that you're still here. People care about you, whether you believe it or not." Jonathan turned away, unable to meet his friend's gaze. He felt trapped in a cycle of grief and anger, and the thought of stepping back into the spotlight felt like an insurmountable task. Memories of the past flooded his mind. Press conferences, speeches, the weight of the world on his shoulders. It was a burden he had willingly carried once, but now it felt like a chain binding him to a life he no longer recognized. "Think about it, will you?" Tom pressed, his voice softening as he placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "You can't hide forever. You have friends who want to support you. You have to let them in." As Tom departed, Jonathan returned to his armchair, the familiar sense of solitude wrapping around him like a comforting blanket. He couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped, both by his own emotions and by the expectations of those around him. The evening wore on, the television continuing to flicker with meaningless images, while his thoughts spiraled deeper into the void. Days passed, and he found himself caught in an unrelenting cycle of isolation, the outside world a distant memory. It was during this time of introspection that Ruby Anderson entered his life, a whirlwind of energy and spirit. She arrived at his doorstep with an unyielding determination that contrasted sharply with his own despondency. Ruby was a Texan through and through, her presence bursting with life and laughter, a stark contrast to the heavy air that surrounded Jonathan. The moment she stepped into his home, the atmosphere shifted. She took stock of the surroundings with a keen eye, her nose wrinkling at the layers of dust that had settled on the furniture. It was a clear indication of neglect, and Ruby was not one to shy away from calling it as she saw it. "Well, Mr. Hale," she began, her voice laced with a Texas twang that felt both foreign and refreshing. "Looks like we've got some work to do here. This place needs a little love, don't you think?" Jonathan's first instinct was to retreat further into his shell, to resent her cheerful demeanor and the way she seemed to impose herself into his life without invitation. He watched her as she moved about the room, her energy infectious yet overwhelming. She began dusting the surfaces, her movements brisk and efficient, as if she were on a mission to eradicate the gloom that had settled over his home. "Who hired you?" he thought, an internal grumble simmering beneath the surface. He had expected someone more reserved, perhaps a soothing presence to ease him through this tumultuous time. Instead, he had Ruby, an unstoppable force of nature, who seemed unfazed by his scowls and reluctance to engage. Ruby's laughter rang through the halls, a sound that seemed to bounce off the walls, breaking the silence that had long claimed residence in Jonathan's life. She didn't shy away from sharing snippets of her life, colorful anecdotes that painted a picture of a world full of adventure and whimsy. With each story, she chipped away at the walls he had built around himself, though he remained stubbornly resistant. In the weeks that followed, Ruby's determination to bring him back to life became evident. She refused to allow him to wallow in his misery, dragging him out for walks, coaxing him to share his thoughts, even if those thoughts were laced with bitterness. Jonathan found himself torn between annoyance and a strange sense of gratitude for her unrelenting spirit. As the Presidential Day celebration loomed closer, he felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him once more. Ruby, with her unyielding optimism, insisted that he at least consider attending. "You can't hide forever, Mr. Hale," she would say, a playful grin lighting up her face. "Besides, I'll be right by your side. Who could possibly bother you with me around?" Yet, even as he contemplated her words, he remained steadfast in his reluctance. The thought of returning to the public eye filled him with dread, and the prospect of facing the probing questions about his life and the loss of Eleanor felt insurmountable. But Ruby's laughter lingered in his mind, a reminder that perhaps life was worth engaging with again, even if it frightened him. In the quiet moments of reflection, as he gazed at the photographs of his late wife, he felt a stirring within him, a flicker of hope that had long been extinguished. Perhaps, just perhaps, Ruby would be the catalyst to push him beyond the walls of his grief. Yet, the uncertainty loomed large, and Jonathan Hale found himself at a crossroads, teetering between the comfort of solitude and the unknown that awaited him outside. Ruby stood in the kitchen, her hands deftly chopping vegetables as she hummed an upbeat country tune. The sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow on the room. Yet Jonathan Hale remained ensconced in the shadows of his living room. He sat slouched in a worn armchair, the fabric faded and threadbare, a stark reflection of his own state of mind. Outside, the world buzzed with life, but inside, the air felt heavy, thick with the remnants of grief and solitude that clung to him like a second skin. As Ruby prepared dinner, she occasionally stole glances at Jonathan, her brow furrowed in concern. She could see the way he avoided eye contact, how he retreated into himself, as if the walls of the house were closing in on him. It was a challenge, she thought, to coax him out of this shell he had built around himself since the death of his wife. The former president was a man who had once commanded attention, who had stood at the helm of power and led a nation, yet here he was, a shadow of that man, trapped in a cycle of bitterness and loss. "Jonathan," she said, her voice breaking the silence like a gentle breeze, "you can't just hide away forever. You're going to miss out on life." He grunted in response, the sound more of a dismissal than an acknowledgement. Ruby rolled her eyes, a mixture of frustration and determination bubbling within her. She had seen people like him before, men and women who had lost something so integral to their identity that they struggled to find their way back. But Ruby was not one to back down easily. She was a force of nature, a whirlwind of energy wrapped in a Texan drawl, and she was determined to help him rediscover the joy he had tucked away. Presidential Day is coming up, she continued, her voice laced with enthusiasm. You should go. It's a chance to reconnect, to show everyone that you're still here, still alive. Jonathan's expression darkened at the mention of the event. The mere thought of attending a gathering filled with the political elite, the very people who had once hung on his every word, made his stomach churn. He could already envision the awkward questions, the well-meaning but intrusive comments about his life, his loss, and his future. He imagined the whispers that would follow him, the pity in their eyes. No, he wanted no part of it. But Ruby was relentless. She placed the chopping knife down and turned to face him fully, hands on her hips, her fiery spirit radiating from her. You know what? You need to get out there, she declared, her voice unwavering. You need to show them that you're not just a former president, you're Jonathan Hale. You're still you, and you deserve to enjoy life. He could feel the weight of her words as they settled between them. There was a challenge in her gaze, a spark of defiance that both irritated and intrigued him. Jonathan took a moment to consider her proposition, the wheels in his mind turning slowly. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps it was time to step out of the shadows, even if just for a night. But the thought of it filled him with a sense of dread. Okay, I'll think about it, he finally relented, his voice gruff as he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unwilling to fully commit. Ruby's face lit up with a smile that was infectious, her excitement palpable. She clapped her hands together and began to move around the kitchen, her energy infusing the space with a sense of anticipation. Jonathan watched her, bemused by the way she seemed to breathe life into every corner of the house. It was as if she had a magic touch, and he found himself reluctantly drawn to her spirit. Later that evening, as Ruby prepared for the event, she rummaged through her closet, excitedly pulling out dresses and accessories, each one more vibrant than the last. Jonathan remained in the living room, half-heartedly perusing a book while stealing glances at her through the doorway. The sight of her bustling around, her laughter echoing through the house, was a stark contrast to the stifling silence that had enveloped him for so long. He watched as she held up a stunning red dress against her figure, admiring herself in the mirror. The fabric hugged her curves perfectly, and she twirled, the dress flowing around her like a flame. Ruby had a way of making everything seem brighter, more alive. It was a stark reminder of the vibrancy he had lost. As she continued her preparations, Jonathan felt an odd sensation stirring within him. The thought of attending the Presidential Day celebration, while still daunting, began to take on a different hue. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe he could endure the evening if he had Ruby by his side, her irreverent chatter and spirited demeanor acting as a buffer against the world he had so long avoided. Finally, she emerged from the bedroom, fully dressed and glowing with confidence. Jonathan felt a pang of surprise at how beautiful she looked, the red dress accentuating her features and the joy in her eyes. It was a sight he hadn't realized he had missed until that moment. "Are you ready?" she asked, her excitement palpable as she bounced on her toes. Jonathan nodded, though the knot in his stomach tightened. They arrived at the venue, an opulent hall adorned with glittering chandeliers and lavish decorations, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive perfumes. As they stepped inside, Ruby took his arm, her grip firm and reassuring. Jonathan felt an odd sense of comfort in her presence, despite his growing anxiety about the night ahead. The moment they entered, a hush fell over the room, followed by a flurry of whispers. Jonathan's discomfort deepened, but Ruby's laughter rang out, breaking the tension. She effortlessly navigated the crowd, drawing attention away from him, her stories and anecdotes lightening the mood. He watched as she animatedly recounted a tale, her hands waving in the air, gesturing with enthusiasm. Jonathan felt both a sense of embarrassment and admiration as the guests leaned in, captivated by her charm. He wanted nothing more than to fade into the background. Yet there was something about Ruby's presence that made him want to stand taller, to engage with the world rather than retreat from it. As the evening unfolded, he found himself slipping into a rhythm he hadn't experienced in years. Ruby's laughter echoed around him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of joy amidst the shadows of his past. The night was not just about the celebration. It was about rediscovering himself, about the possibility of moving forward, even if it was just one small step. In that moment, surrounded by laughter and the warmth of Ruby's spirit, Jonathan realized that perhaps he could embrace the night ahead, not as a former president shrouded in grief, but as Jonathan Hale, a man still capable of feeling, of living, and of loving life once more. As Jonathan and Ruby stepped into the grand ballroom, an air of anticipation enveloped them, punctuated by the soft clinking of glasses and the rustle of silk dresses. The room was filled with the elite of the political world, a dazzling array of laughter and conversation that echoed off the high ceilings. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, casting a warm glow over the gathering, while the elegantly decorated tables overflowed with flowers and fine china. Yet, in stark contrast to the spectacle and glamour surrounding him, Jonathan felt like a ghost in a world he had long since distanced himself from. His heart raced slightly, but not from excitement. It was more a mix of apprehension and discomfort. Jonathan's eyes darted around the room, searching for familiar faces, desperately hoping to blend into the background. The whispers and gasps that followed their entrance made him want to shrink into himself. He felt the weight of their gazes, assessing him, judging him. The former president, the widower who had retreated from public life, now returning under the arm of a woman so vibrantly alive. It was as if the sun had burst into the room. Ruby, however, was a different story. The moment they stepped inside, she became a force of nature. Her laughter rang out like a bell, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. She was in her element, completely unfazed by the scrutiny they faced. With her fiery red dress hugging her curves and her blonde hair cascading in playful waves, she was a stark contrast to Jonathan's understated demeanor. He watched in disbelief as she wove through the crowd, her presence magnetic, drawing people in like moths to a flame. It wasn't long before she began recounting stories from Jonathan's time in office, her voice animated and full of life. She spoke of events that had once seemed so serious and cutthroat, now transformed into humorous anecdotes through her unique lens. Jonathan cringed inwardly, fearing the potential embarrassment of her recollections. He could see the delight on the faces of the audience as they leaned in, captivated by her tales, and he felt the heat rise in his cheeks. It was as if Ruby had taken control of the narrative, and he was merely a prop in her performance. Despite his discomfort, Jonathan couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. Ruby had an ability to connect with people effortlessly, a skill he had once mastered but had long since abandoned. He noted how her expressive gestures and infectious laughter seemed to lighten the atmosphere, bringing smiles to faces that had been too serious for too long. The political elite, often wrapped in their own significance, were momentarily disarmed by Ruby's charm. Jonathan felt a strange mix of frustration and pride at having someone like her beside him, a woman who could command a room with her spirit. But as the evening wore on, Jonathan wrestled with his emotions. He tried to pull Ruby back towards him, to rein her in and retreat into the shadows where he felt more comfortable. Yet, each time he made an effort, she merely laughed and pulled away, her joy infectious, her light too bright to be contained. The more he tried to shield himself from the attention, the more he realized he was drawn to her irrepressible energy. It was like watching a flower bloom before his eyes, vibrant and full of life, while he felt like a wilting plant, struggling to survive in a world that had once been his domain. As Ruby continued to enchant the crowd, Jonathan found himself observing her, studying the way she moved, the way she interacted with others. He noticed how her eyes sparkled when she spoke, how her laughter seemed to resonate within him, stirring feelings he had thought were buried beneath his grief. It was unsettling, this awakening of emotions that had been dormant for so long. He felt a warmth in his chest, a flicker of something akin to hope. But frustration mingled with that warmth. He didn't want to feel this way, didn't want to be reminded of the joy he had lost. The evening progressed, and Jonathan's internal struggle deepened. He watched Ruby as she captivated the crowd with stories that painted him in a light he wasn't sure he deserved. She described a particularly challenging negotiation he'd navigated with wit and humor, turning what had been a tense moment into a humorous tale of miscommunication and accidental blunders. The audience roared with laughter at her portrayal, and Jonathan felt his heart race, not from pride, but from embarrassment. He wanted to tell her to stop, to not make him the center of attention, yet the way she spoke about him, with warmth and affection, made it difficult to pull her back. In the midst of the laughter, Jonathan became acutely aware of the distance between them. It was as if he stood on one side of a vast chasm, while Ruby danced on the other, drawing the crowd into her orbit. He felt both a sense of dread and an inexplicable yearning. This was not the man he had intended to be, a shadow lurking in the periphery, overshadowed by someone who seemed so effortlessly vibrant. Yet, he couldn't shake the deep-seated admiration for her spirit, the way she breathed life into the room and into him. Jonathan's mind raced as he grappled with the realization that had been creeping in all night. He was falling for Ruby. It was absurd, he thought. He had lost so much, had buried his heart and his hopes along with his wife. Yet, here she was, a whirlwind of vitality, challenging everything he thought he knew about himself and his future. The notion filled him with both excitement and dread. What did it mean to open his heart again? Could he truly let someone in after so much loss? He felt a tightening in his chest, a conflict between the desire to embrace this unexpected connection and the fear of vulnerability that had haunted him since the day he lost his wife. Ruby's laughter echoed through the room, and he momentarily closed his eyes, surrendering to the sound. It was a reminder of what life could be, what it could feel like to share laughter and joy again, even amidst the shadows of his past. As the night wore on, Jonathan stood back, observing Ruby as she continued to engage with the guests. He felt the tug of her presence, the warmth of her spirit radiating towards him, but he remained anchored in his apprehension. He was on the precipice of something profound, and yet he hesitated, unsure if he could leap into the unknown. The ballroom pulsed with life, laughter, and connection, and yet he felt like a spectator, a man caught between two worlds, the one he had lost and the one that beckoned him to embrace the light. In this moment of reflection, Jonathan realized that he was not just wrestling with his feelings for Ruby. He was grappling with the very essence of who he was. Would he continue to hide away in the shadows, or could he muster the courage to step into the light, to embrace the laughter and warmth that Ruby so freely offered? The answer was elusive, a delicate balance between fear and hope, and as he watched her shine, he felt the stirrings of something he thought he had lost forever, a renewed desire to live, to feel, and possibly to love again. Amidst the laughter and applause that filled the grand hall, Jonathan Hale found himself standing at a precipice of both anxiety and determination. The evening had transformed into an unexpected whirlwind, one he had never anticipated when he agreed to accompany Ruby Anderson to the Presidential Day celebration. Having spent the better part of the last few years wrapped in a cocoon of solitude, the cacophony of voices and the shimmering lights felt overwhelming. Yet here he was, poised to reclaim the narrative that Ruby had so effortlessly commandeered. As he adjusted his tie, a gesture that felt both familiar and foreign, he noticed Ruby across the room. She was a beacon of vitality, her laughter ringing out like a joyful chime, drawing in guests like moths to a flame. Her red dress seemed to dance with her as she animatedly shared one of her infamous tales about his time in office, a time that felt like a distant memory, cloaked in the shadows of his grief. Jonathan felt a pang of discomfort as he watched her, a mix of admiration and frustration swelling within him. He knew he had to step in. With a deep breath, he cleared his throat, the sound barely audible over the cheerful din. He felt the eyes of the crowd shift toward him, a mixture of curiosity and expectation. Jonathan was no stranger to being in the spotlight. He had navigated political arenas and faced countless interviews. Yet, the weight of this moment was unlike anything he had experienced. He stood, a former president amid a sea of familiar faces, now turned into a whirlwind of strangers, all eager to see what he would say. But just as he began to speak, an unexpected interruption reverberated through the hall. Ruby, with all her Texan flair, playfully interjected, spinning around to face him. She was a force of nature, her energy infectious. The room erupted with laughter as she quipped about his famed speeches, teasingly suggesting they often put audiences to sleep. Jonathan felt the heat rise to his cheeks, half amused and half exasperated. She had a way of dismantling his carefully built facade, and despite his initial irritation, he couldn't help but smile. It was a comedic exchange that painted them both in a warm light, the audience captivated by their chemistry. Ruby's irreverence was a breath of fresh air, and Jonathan felt his worries begin to dissipate amidst the laughter. The crowd responded with applause, their approval washing over him like a wave, and for the first time that evening, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years: connection. However, the mood shifted abruptly when a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Lawrence Granger, a former rival and a man known for his sharp tongue and sharper wit, strode toward them. The air grew tense as he approached, a predatory glint in his eyes. Lawrence had always relished the chance to undermine Jonathan, and tonight was no exception. His presence felt like a dark cloud hovering over the vibrant atmosphere Ruby had cultivated. Still playing the grieving widower, "I see," Lawrence sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Hiding behind your new friend to avoid dealing with your sad little life?" The room fell silent, the laughter fading as guests exchanged uneasy glances. Jonathan's stomach twisted at Lawrence's words, but before he could formulate a response, Ruby stepped forward, her demeanor shifting from playful to fierce in the blink of an eye. "Now, hold on just a minute, Granger," she shot back, her voice unwavering. "You don't get to come here and throw shade like that. Jonathan has faced more than you'll ever know, and it's high time someone put you in your place." Jonathan felt a rush of gratitude mixed with surprise. Ruby, with her fierce loyalty and unapologetic spirit, was standing up for him in a way he had not anticipated. It was as if she had peeled back the layers of his defensiveness, revealing a vulnerability he had long buried. The crowd began to murmur, their eyes darting between Ruby and Lawrence, intrigued by the unexpected confrontation. Lawrence, taken aback by Ruby's sudden ferocity, floundered for a moment, the smirk on his face faltering. "Is this your new strategy, Hale? Surrounding yourself with loudmouths?" "Loudmouths?" Ruby echoed, her voice rising. "I prefer to think of it as having someone around who speaks the truth, something you wouldn't recognize if it bit you." Her eyes sparkled with defiance, and Jonathan felt a swell of admiration for her courage. The tension in the air shifted, with the crowd now leaning in, captivated by the unfolding drama. Jonathan, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events, realized that Ruby's fierce spirit wasn't just an act. It was a reflection of her unwavering loyalty. She had stepped into his world, faced his demons head-on, and in that moment, he felt a bond forming between them that transcended their caregiver-patient relationship. As Lawrence sputtered, trying to regain his composure, the guests began to murmur in support of Ruby's bold defense. The tide was turning, and Jonathan could see the shift in their perceptions. No longer was he just a former president plagued by loss. He was a man who deserved respect, and Ruby was standing right beside him, unwavering. In the aftermath of the confrontation, Jonathan found himself enveloped in an atmosphere of newfound respect. The laughter returned, but this time it was accompanied by a sense of camaraderie. The crowd no longer viewed him as a relic of the past. They saw him as a man, flawed but resilient, standing alongside a woman who had breathed life back into him. Jonathan's heart raced as he stole a glance at Ruby. She was radiant, her confidence shining through the remnants of the earlier tension. It was as if she had unleashed a part of him that he thought was lost forever, and he felt lighter somehow. The walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack, and with Ruby by his side, he felt emboldened to face whatever came next. As the evening continued, the energy in the room transformed, a palpable excitement underlying the air of celebration. Guests approached Jonathan with genuine smiles, offering anecdotes and compliments that felt sincere rather than obligatory. He was no longer just the former president. He was Jonathan, a man who had weathered storms and was now ready to embrace the sunshine once again. In the midst of the revelry, Ruby continued to weave her magic, recounting stories that had the crowd in stitches. Jonathan watched her, mesmerized by her ability to connect with people, to pull them in and make them feel like they belonged. Each laugh echoed in his heart, reminding him of the joy he had long since forgotten. As the night wore on, laughter and applause filled the air, and Jonathan felt a warmth spreading through him. Surrounded by friends and unexpected supporters, he realized he was beginning to let go of the weight of his past. The walls he had meticulously constructed over the years were crumbling, and in their place was a budding sense of hope. With Ruby by his side, he felt the promise of new beginnings, a chance to redefine not just his public persona but his private life as well. It was a journey he hadn't anticipated but welcomed wholeheartedly. He could feel a shift within himself, a willingness to embrace vulnerability, to accept that moving on did not mean forgetting. Instead, it meant honoring the past while welcoming the future. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan Hale felt ready to step into that future, hand in hand with the woman who had ignited a spark within him. As the vibrant atmosphere of the Presidential Day celebration buzzed around him, Jonathan Hale leaned against a marble column, his heart heavy with an unexpected weight. The laughter and clinking of glasses echoed in the grand hall, but the invigorating energy that had enveloped him moments ago had fled. He caught sight of Ruby, who was regaling a small group with another one of her animated stories, her hands gesturing wildly, her laughter infectious. Yet, he couldn't shake the nagging sense of anxiety that had begun to creep in. It wasn't just the overwhelming crowd or the flashes of cameras that seemed to follow him, but something deeper, a fear of losing the only person who had begun to breach the fortress of solitude he had built around himself. Then, his heart sank as he overheard a group of guests whispering just a few feet away. Their words, laced with mild amusement and condescension, cut through the celebratory murmur like a knife. They spoke of Ruby in dismissive tones, alluding to her as merely a caregiver, a temporary fixture in the life of the former president. What could he possibly see in her? One woman giggled, and another nodded in agreement, their laughter ringing hollow against the backdrop of the party. The sting of their judgment flashed through Jonathan, igniting an anger he hadn't felt in years. It was a familiar sensation, one he had endured countless times during his political career, but this time it was different. This time, it was about Ruby. His stomach twisted into knots as he watched Ruby's bright smile falter, her eyes momentarily clouded with hurt before she plastered a facade of cheer back on her face. His instinct was to rush to her side, to defend her against the unkindness of others. But he hesitated, rooted in place by an unfamiliar mix of guilt and frustration. Had he truly taken her for granted? Had he allowed her vibrant spirit to be overshadowed by the whispers of those who didn't understand the depth of their connection? The thought churned within him, igniting a sense of urgency that propelled him forward. Stepping away from the comforting solidity of the column, Jonathan navigated through the crowd, each step fueled by the need to reach Ruby before she withdrew completely from the evening's festivities. He maneuvered past clusters of guests who were oblivious to his internal struggle, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of music that filled the air. He spotted Ruby's distinctive red dress near the exit, its brilliance dimming against the shadow of the night. She had stepped outside, away from the noise, seeking solace in the cool evening air. When he finally reached her, Ruby stood at the edge of the terrace, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if shielding herself from more than just the chill. The glow of the moonlight illuminated her features, casting soft shadows across her face. She appeared small, almost fragile, a stark contrast to the vibrant woman who had dominated the evening's narrative. Jonathan's heart ached at the sight, a pang of regret washing over him as he approached her. He hesitated, unsure of how to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. But as she turned, her eyes meeting his, he saw the flicker of vulnerability that lay beneath her usual bravado. Here was a woman who had stepped into his life and changed its course, and yet he had allowed others to dictate how he perceived her. He took a deep breath, the air thick with unspoken words. "Ruby," he began, his voice low and earnest. But the silence that hung between them spoke volumes, more than words ever could. She looked away, the hurt evident in her posture, and he felt his heart tighten in response. He stepped closer, closing the distance, and continued, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much their words would affect you. I should have been there. I should have defended you." She remained quiet, her gaze still fixed on the dark horizon, and Jonathan felt a surge of desperation. He took another step, reaching out, and placed a tentative hand on her shoulder. The moment his skin touched the fabric of her dress, she turned to face him fully, her eyes searching his. "I've spent so long building walls around myself," he confessed, the weight of his admission feeling both liberating and terrifying. "I was afraid to let anyone in. I thought I could just exist. But you've shown me how much I've missed, how much I've lost." Ruby's eyes glistened with unspoken emotions, and Jonathan felt a swell of hope. "I've been so focused on my past, on the loss I've endured, that I forgot what it feels like to truly connect with someone. You've brought light back into my life, Ruby." As the words hung in the air, the walls he had built around his heart began to crumble. He could see the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the understanding that they both had been navigating through their own shadows. In that moment, Jonathan realized that his fear of moving on had been replaced by a profound desire to embrace the future, to embrace Ruby. Tentatively, he stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her into a warm embrace. She melted against him, her tension dissipating as she reciprocated the gesture. Jonathan held her tightly, wishing he could shield her from the hurtful words that had reached her ears. In the distance, the sounds of the party continued, but in that moment, it was as if the world had faded away. They stood together, enveloped in a cocoon of warmth and understanding, the connection between them deepening as they shared a silence that spoke volumes. Jonathan breathed in the scent of her hair, a mix of sweet and spicy notes that made his heart race. But the tranquility was shattered by a sudden flash of light. A photographer, lingering nearby, had captured their embrace, the moment immortalized in a snapshot. The sound of the camera shutter snapped Jonathan back to reality, and he pulled away slightly, his cheeks flushing with embarrassment. As Ruby stepped back, her eyes widened in surprise. Jonathan could only imagine the speculation that would swirl around them in the aftermath of such a moment. The whispers, the gossip, the headlines that would undoubtedly follow. It was all too familiar, yet this time it felt different, charged with a mix of excitement and apprehension. But as he looked at Ruby, he felt a strange sense of defiance rising within him. No matter what others said, no matter the rumors that would inevitably spread, he knew one thing for certain. Their connection was real. The unexpected bond they had forged, born out of laughter and heartache, was worth fighting for. In the moments that followed, the world around them began to blur again, the noise of the party fading into a distant hum. Jonathan reached for Ruby's hand, intertwining their fingers, a silent promise that he would no longer shy away from what they had begun to build together. Whatever the future held, he was ready to face it together. The sun rose the following day, casting its warm glow through the large windows of Jonathan Hale's home. The remnants of the previous night's Presidential Day celebration still lingered in the air, but the atmosphere had shifted significantly. The once jubilant echoes of laughter and applause had been replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant sound of news anchors' voices filtering through the television. Jonathan, still grappling with the whirlwind of emotions from the night before, sat slumped in his favorite chair, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. As he sipped his coffee, the headlines flashed across the screen, each more sensational than the last. Former President Hale's romantic revival. Is love in the air? Read one. Another claimed, new caregiver captivates the heart of the nation. It was as if the world had suddenly decided to paint him in broad strokes, transforming his quiet life into a spectacle. The incessant buzz of the media made him acutely aware of the attention now directed toward him and Ruby. He felt exposed, like a fish in a glass bowl for everyone to scrutinize. Despite the initial surge of embarrassment that washed over him, Jonathan could not ignore the warmth that Ruby had ignited within him. Her presence had been a catalyst for change, forcing him to confront feelings he had buried deep since his wife's passing. As the morning wore on, he found himself contemplating the depth of their connection, a bond that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. In that moment of reflection, he realized he valued her more than he had dared to admit. Meanwhile, Ruby was in the kitchen, her laughter mingling with the sound of clattering pots and pans. She was attempting to recreate one of her grandmother's famous breakfast recipes, a cacophony of spices and sizzling that filled the house with an inviting aroma. Unbeknownst to Jonathan, she was equally affected by the media frenzy, her thoughts racing as she prepared breakfast. She had always been a woman with a robust sense of self, but the newfound attention made her feel both elated and apprehensive. As she flipped a pancake, Ruby couldn't help but think about the way Jonathan had looked at her the night before. His eyes had softened, revealing a vulnerability she hadn't expected from the stoic former president. The connection between them felt palpable, and she found herself smiling at the memory. Yet, she also worried about what it all meant. Was it just a fleeting moment, a product of an unusual night, or something deeper? The doorbell rang, breaking her reverie. Ruby wiped her hands on a towel and made her way to the door, opening it to a flurry of reporters, cameras flashing, eager to capture Jonathan's every move. She instinctively stepped in front of him, shielding him from the barrage of questions and intrusive inquiries. In that moment, Ruby became a force of nature, her protective instincts kicking in as she faced the media storm. "Gentlemen, this is a private matter," she stated firmly, her Texas drawl cutting through the noise. The reporters hesitated, momentarily taken aback by her fierce demeanor. Jonathan stood behind her, bewildered and slightly amused by Ruby's unyielding spirit. He had always been accustomed to the polished political maneuvering of his aides, but this was different. This was real, raw, and undeniably refreshing. The reporters, sensing a story, continued to press. "Is it true, Mr. Hale? Are you in a relationship with your caregiver?" one shouted, leaning in closer. Jonathan felt the weight of the question, an urge to retreat creeping in, but Ruby's presence anchored him. "Let's just say that it's complicated," Jonathan finally responded, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. The truth was complicated, and he knew that. He glanced at Ruby, who nodded in approval, her confidence bolstering his own. As the door closed, Ruby turned to Jonathan with a grin. "You handled that like a pro. I'd say you have a knack for the spotlight after all." Jonathan chuckled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "Thanks to you, I suppose." Their banter was interrupted by the sound of Jonathan's phone buzzing incessantly on the table. He picked it up, his heart racing as he read the messages flooding in from friends and former colleagues, all addressing the scandal that had erupted surrounding Jonathan's rival from the previous night. The news was shocking. A corruption scandal that had been brewing for years was finally coming to light. The rival's downfall was swift and brutal. The media had a field day, dissecting every aspect of his career. Jonathan felt a strange sense of vindication wash over him. The man who had tormented him politically was now ensnared in a web of his own making. It was a twist of fate that Jonathan had never anticipated, nor had he wished for it, but the irony was not lost on him. As the day progressed, the news about the rival's corruption spread like wildfire, and with it, the public's perception of Jonathan began to shift. No longer was he merely a former president lost in the shadows of his past. He was becoming a symbol of integrity amidst the chaos. Ruby stood by his side through it all, her unwavering support bolstering his resolve. In the days that followed, they became an unexpected duo, an unlikely alliance that resonated with the public. Jonathan found himself embracing the attention, not for his own sake, but to highlight the importance of honesty and resilience, values that he and Ruby shared. He began to recognize the power of their connection and how it was igniting a spark within him that he thought had long been extinguished. One evening, after a long day of navigating the media onslaught and public appearances, Jonathan sat down with Ruby in the living room. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken words, the air thick with anticipation. He had been contemplating how to express his feelings, the ones he had kept hidden for so long. "Ruby," he began, his voice steady despite the vulnerability he felt. She turned to him, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. He took a deep breath, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "I want you to stay, not just as my caregiver, but as a partner, someone I can share my life with." He watched her reaction closely, searching for any hint of uncertainty. Instead, he found warmth and understanding reflected in her gaze. In that moment, he realized that Ruby had not only brought joy back into his life, but had become an integral part of his journey toward healing. As they embraced, Jonathan felt a profound sense of relief, as if the walls he had built around himself were crumbling. The world outside faded away, leaving only the two of them in their newfound connection. They were ready to step into the light together, prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, not as two solitary figures, but as partners bound by a shared journey. In the days that followed, the media frenzy continued, but Jonathan and Ruby navigated it with newfound confidence. They had transformed from mere subjects of gossip into a beacon of hope for others, a testament to the power of resilience and love. The headlines shifted from scandal to a heartwarming narrative of redemption and companionship. Jonathan Hale had emerged from the shadows, not just as a former president, but as a man who had rediscovered the capacity to love. And Ruby Anderson, the spirited Texan, had become the woman who brought him back to life, illuminating the path ahead. Together, they were ready to face the world, hand in hand, their hearts intertwined in a story of unexpected joy.